Okay, so we're here with Chris Miller, the creator of Ankur, the Kingdom of the Gods. Is that correct?
That's
Um,
right.
and Chris approached me about having a chat about Ankur and game design, and so we decided to set this up and record this little session. And if you're interested in the game while we're talking about it, you can find it on Drive-Through RPG. You can order it in Barnes and Noble and on Amazon. We'll drop some links in the description below, so check those out. Chris is always available to answer questions and things through Drive-Through RPG if you have any questions. Or if you want to comment on the bottom of this video, I'm sure Chris will check back on it periodically and answer any questions as well. So, Chris, this has been a labor of love for you for 10 years, and we had a little brief discussion about it to just encapsulate for me what sort of got you into the game design and a little bit about the history of why you've decided to create this setting.
Well, I guess what ultimately what got me into it, what caused me to jump down this rabbit hole, as it were. Um, as I had mentioned before, I was a little unhappy at my regular 9 to 5 job, and had always had a very long kind of a history or background with role playing. I had started playing Dungeons and Dragons and other games back in the early 80s, I think 82, 83. And so that was a pastime for me, and it was something I was very comfortable with doing, with running games and, GMing and that sort of thing. And, so when I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life, I thought, well, why not try to create a role-playing game. And I come from, back in the 90s, for example, there were tons of games on the market. It was very saturated, actually, but there were a ton of different ideas. And, now I notice a bit of a resurgence in role-playing, but I have to say that with that resurgence, the genres that are available, I feel, are a little limited, and everything's a D20 system, So I really wanted to put my own product out there and do something different, and I wasn't sure at the time what I wanted that to be. I messed around with ideas, for a couple of years actually, and wrote down a lot of things on scratch paper and cocktail napkins, and I started to put some things together when I met a friend of mine who got me into the ancient aliens theory. And he introduced me to Eric von Daniken's book, Chariot of the Gods. And I started reading pretty extensively into that, pseudoscience and mythology and history. And I thought, well, I don't know if any of this is true, but it would make a heck of a backdrop for a game, And I really committed to trying to build my own system and my own game world, and make it as realistic as possible. I was a history major in college myself, and so I did enjoy Middle Eastern history in particular, and I focused on Sumerian mythology for the game. I use the Sumerian language and cosmology for most of the setting, and it almost seemed to write itself. Some of the things are very outlandish, and but they deal with everything from space travel to time travel to gods coming from other worlds and creating the human race, and they talk about ray guns and destructive weapons that could, obliterate entire cities. And so, I just took all that and decided to try to create a world that would be interesting to play in.
It's
And so that's kind of where it all started.
it's very different in terms of what you tend to see in RPGs. Just from a cursory look at it, you can tell that you're in for something quite different. You know, and there was a couple of reviews that I read that said the same thing. This is not D&D.
Right.
This is very much a
And
different style of game. Yeah.
that's for several reasons. I obviously, you get critiqued quite a bit by other gamers that will equate a lot of games to D&D, and I tried to steer away from that as much as possible. I didn't want to, you know, infringe on anybody else's properties or steal any ideas and everything. And even though the D20 system at the time had just gone into open license, and there were some problems with that, and I noticed even back then that once Hasbro had purchased Wizards of the Coast, there were some people that were getting into some legal trouble because of some of the wording of the open license, and so I just decided to steer away from Dungeons and Dragons and D20 entirely, and I ended up using a D12 system for the game. And as far as I know, right now it's the only D12 system on the market. And I don't know exactly. People have asked me why I chose D12, and
it's an underused
it wasn't
dice.
my first choice. Yeah, well, it's a very underrated die. Yeah, but yeah. It wasn't my first choice. I just I knew that I had a specific type of mechanic that we'll get into later that I wanted to use for the game, and mathematically, all the other dice just didn't work. Not as well, And I tried D20 originally, and I moved to a D10, and I moved to a D8 and 2D6. I even had an idea where I was going to use a pool of dice at one point. But D12 was mathematically sound, and it just seemed to work the best. And in fact, with my game, you only need one D12 to play the game in its entirety. So there's no other dice.
That's great.
You don't even need multiple 12s. You just need one D12.
Which makes it functionally clean, because then obviously you're not having to explain different dice, especially to new people who've never played an RPG, to be handed these little plastic balls and say, right, okay, you need to roll these. Having one is much easier. That's exactly right. And that was actually part of my thinking at the time too, was I had a gaming group for years and years, all through high school and college. And, I'm 45 now. And so we all split up, people get married, they move out of the state, and they have jobs, then the children and stuff, and they can't play as often. So when it came time to play test the game, I really didn't have anybody that I was real comfortable with to draw from, except my wife and some friends and family who had never played games before. Yeah.
And so I really wanted to make the system something accessible to people who weren't familiar with Dungeons and Dragons or other games, and could grasp those concepts fairly quickly,
That's what I find right now. When you said earlier that there's a bit of an interest building in tabletop RPGs, there are probably more new players now than there've ever been in RPG history. So for small producers like yourself and myself, this is our into the next generation of role-playing gamers who haven't been touched by D&D yet, because it's the elephant in the room. It's kind of, you can't, obviously you're going to be compared to it. Anybody who's over the age of, 25 is going to compare you to D&D. But the thing is, anybody who's younger, because there's a lot of younger people now, they're not, the younger generation are not the going out and partying type crowd. They're the stay at home and play board games and video games crowd.
Right.
kind of culture has inculcated itself through technology, and those people, when they want to step away from technology, are now embracing board games and role-playing games and things like that.
Right.
In my opinion, obviously, but that's what I see. Um,
No, I see the same thing. Yeah. I think you're exactly right. Um,
and they're going
you
to
know,
drive
we,
the future generation of these kind of games. I have a lot of younger people that follow my channel. I get a lot of messages from people saying, I was interested in role playing games. I found your channel. It seems very different to what other people are doing because most channels are D&D oriented, and so that is the point of difference. Really, is it's not D&D. You can do D&D type things, but it's not D&D.
sure.
And having not actually played Ankur, but having just a brief read about it, you can immediately tell you're in for a different type of experience. So, leading from that, when you were developing the mechanic, you were developing the mechanic after you had the setting idea. So it was kind of the mechanics were coming from the
Yeah.
setting rather than the other way around. Is that correct?
Yeah. Uh, to a large extent, yeah. I think even early on, I had some ideas in the back of my head and on the way that I wanted it to work. I actually had something of a dream, where I woke up and I had this idea for a core mechanic in my head, and I couldn't get rid of it, and I said, well, this doesn't work with what I was trying at the time, but I think it was more important than the type of die that I was going to use, So I decided to kind of scrap what I had and try to incorporate this no matter what, And so the core mechanic for this system is called an action potential number, and there are no class levels in this game. So instead, you have skill levels. You point by your way in to your stats, and your stat range is from 1 to 5. Now your skill level ranges between 1 and 9. Now on a D12, what you're trying to do is you want to add your stat to your skill level. That creates your APN, or your action potential number, and that's your target. So you want to roll that number or less on a D12 to succeed. If you roll the exact target number, then that's a critical success. If you roll a 12, it's always a critical failure. And if you roll a 1, it's always a success, but never a critical success. And the reason for that is I didn't want novice characters going in and rolling the lowest possible number that they could, and still critting. So it's actually an unskilled person just using their stat typically is not going to be able to crit, particularly if you just have a 1 in that stat, let's say, which is considered below average, but it's not actually that uncommon. Now, obviously, if you're a 9th level blacksmith, and you have a maximum number in your stat of a 5, you can get a 14 or something, right? Well, how can you roll a roll under a 14 or a 14 on a D12? And the way you do that is you stop at 11. Everything over 11 is a wash. Okay, 12 is always going to be a critical failure, so that's off the table. You take the 11 and you count backwards the overage amount. In this case, it'd be 2. And so then, everything from a 9 to an 11 at that point would then be a critical success. So you increase the critical success range. And because the number is based on both your stat and your skill level, each player is going to have a different number that they're shooting for. So it's not like in Dungeons and Dragons, for example, where a 20 is always going to be what you're shooting for.
Okay.
So it's a little different. I think it takes a little getting used to, but it works, and I think it's a lot more fair, I think, in certain ways too. I did notice that, take the stats, for example, in Dungeons and Dragons, the stat range goes from 1 to 20, but the only numbers that really count are the top 5.
Yep.
And I said, well, why do I need this huge range? We could just take it down to 1 to 5 and accomplish the same thing.
Well, I had a similar sort of design philosophy when it came to 70s system, where it was that it's pointless rolling for some kind of generic stat, like, roll 3d6 and that becomes your strength or whatever. It's just these species always have more strength, always have less intelligence or whatever. So that's what you start with. And everyone kind of starts at 0 and then builds through experience on those particular things. So how, with experience, is it like you earn a generic experience and then you buy what you want in specific areas, or do you earn experience in specific skills when you use them?
Yeah, so you earn experience in the game, just like most games, according to scenarios and different situations. But the experience in the system is very unique in that, first of all, I have 3 different types of experience. I don't have just a blanket experience that you give everyone, and part of the reason for that is because there is no class level. I wanted one thing that I had a big problem with in a lot of games, and in particular online RPGs, was the whole hobo killing scenarios that tend to happen. And I used to play World of Warcraft fairly religiously back in the day. And, even I have to say that it was a little silly that you go out in the woods and kill a bunch of boar, and then, oh, wow, now I know how to sew clothing together. I learned, now I've got my new mount because I killed a bunch of goblins. And that never seemed to make sense to me. And a little bit of that even goes on in regular tabletop Dungeons and Dragons, right? I mean, the regardless of the game, it tends to be the way things go is you get a summons from a king who tells you to go kill goblins. You kill a bunch of goblins. You take their stuff. Maybe even you go back to town, kill everybody in town, take their stuff. And then you suddenly go up in level because you have a bunch of gold pieces, and it never made a lot of sense to me. So in this game, with the 3 different types of experience, it's based on there's martial experience, scholastic experience, and spiritual experience. And so what you do in the game will garner you different types of experience that can only be spent on skills that are appropriate for that type of experience.
So you can't go bashing people with a sword and then increase in magic ability. Right. Now, you can if you want to become a good warrior, bashing people with a sword is probably a good thing to do. But then once you cap out or max out in those skills, I mean, there's nothing much, you're kind of a one dog show, or so it's, if you want to do anything more useful with your character, there are a lot of skills in the game, and there's a lot of non-combative type characters you can play. In this game, you can play a scribe, for example, and not actually get laughed out of the gaming room. Scribes in this system are very important because they're the liaisons between the gods and the humans. They are the only ones who are allowed to read and write the sacred languages of the alien, rulers. They're the ones who run the banks and handle all the judicial stuff. They're your lawyers and your judges and
your arbitrators, diplomats. And so, when you take something like the fact that no one in the game can read and write except for a scribe, it becomes very important then to have a scribe with you,
Yeah.
right? And a scribe, if he wants to excel in those skills, has to perform those actions. They'll have to try to translate things. They'll have to try to make maps. They'll have to arbitrate disputes and so on and so forth to get those skills higher. So it's not a blanket type of XP where you can kill a bunch of goblins and then learn how to be a better diplomat.
Yeah, what I call the bash dash win.
Yeah. So and I think it's an incredibly, it's a little more complex than the usual system, but it's incredibly fair, and I think ultimately it just makes more sense to categorize things in that fashion.
And so the game is out now, and you raised money through Kickstarter, which was about 2 years ago. You had a successful Kickstarter. And obviously now more people are playing it. So have you gone back and thought maybe there's certain things that I would change now based on what, or is there a new version that's going to come out, or?
Well, yes and no. I'm currently working on a new expansion to the game. It's a campaign setting for ancient Africa. And that's kind of in wake of the whole Wakanda Black Panther thing. But I had actually envisioned this actually prior to the film. I had focused the main book focuses mostly on the land of Shinar, which is the Middle East on Earth. And so it deals a lot with the Sumerian culture and the neighboring city-states. But I did speak a little bit in the book about, there's a paragraph or two about every place on Earth. And so what my intention is to eventually come out with a supplement for each continent and subcontinent, Australia included, actually. And the first one that I chose to do was Africa. And so it just kind of coincided with the release of Black Panther, and I thought, well, this is great, But I'm still working on that, and it's going to detail 12 city-states, I think, and a slew of new player character species that you can play, some anthropomorphic, half animal and half human hybrids and that sort of thing. Because that's so prevalent in Egyptian mythology and whatnot. And so I'm focusing on that as the next book. And then probably after that, I'm already thinking about a book that will deal with the Hollow Earth theory. And then a book on space travel, the planet Nibiru, and the Mars and Moon bases that are there. And so who knows after that? I don't know, and I do have. I just completed a rules errata for the game. I don't think there's, knock on wood here, but I don't think there's anything I would change outright with the game. It actually seems to work pretty well, but there were a slew of typos and some problems with some of the charts and tables in the book, and I cleaned those up and made them look a lot nicer and a little easier to interpret. And so I fixed all that stuff. There's also crafting in the game, and that's a bit odd, I think, for a tabletop game. But I rather enjoyed that again in World of Warcraft, and so I thought, well, how, if I'm going to kind of create a system where it's not imperative to kill things, although it is a dangerous world, there is combat to be had. It's not a completely non-combat game, but because there's non-combative character classes, I wanted to have the option, particularly with the class called the Shadim. They're known as the builders, or they're a very they have kind of a Masonic guild that rules over them, and I wanted them to be able to craft items, and so a character can make virtually anything. They can make their own weapons, they can make their own armor, they can build houses, they can build Vimana spaceships, you name it. You have to have certain skills to do so, and it's very labor intensive, and you have to make a lot of different roles, but it can be done.
There's a
You can
big
create.
interest currently in survivalist games for computers. That's a
Yeah.
massive growing spectrum of games on Steam. And you see that element in some tabletop RPGs, but you don't really see tabletop RPGs that are survivalist in nature. But it's good that it's starting through games like Ankur. It's starting to come in, because there are a lot of people who enjoy that kind of thing. That you got to go out and find the wood to build the fire,
Yes.
to then melt the metal, to
Right.
then make the sword.
Exactly, and it happens just like that. There's a series of steps that must be gone through. Now you can skip some of those difficulties by going to a market and buying the raw materials that you need to do something. But when it's all said and done, you still have to take those materials, refine them in whichever way that needs to be done for that item, and then make the final crafting roll. And you could mess it up, you could go through this long, laborious process. It may take several weeks to do something and then fail, So that's always an option, But I didn't want it to be easy to just acquire, and I'll say in quotation marks, magic items in this game. There actually is no system of magic in the game.
Yeah.
There's high technology and there's psionics, but for a character to build something that gives bonuses, to abilities or some special. Excuse me, my screen. Yeah,
Sure.
some special usage, within the gameplay. They have to. It has to be difficult, and they have to make certain roles, and there has to be certain sacrifices, and even with the marketplaces, it's stated in the game that you can't just go to a market and typically buy, off the rack, ready-made armor and weapons and whatnot.
I always hate
Typically,
that in computer games. You just rock up to the blacksmith.
yeah,
This is the guy who
sure,
was selling you a 5 gold dagger like 3 hours ago. Now has $500 million swords. Where were they five
right.
hours ago?
So typically, they'll have a few display items,
Yeah.
and some of those may be for sale, but they're, what they're typically going to do. And look, I've been a vendor myself, with this game. I've gone to many conventions, and it takes a lot to lug all this stuff around, and you're bringing hundreds of copies of books and whatever, it takes a small caravan to do something like that. And not every merchant, especially if they have an entire caravan of wagons to carry all his wares from city to city. And so what they do is they'll set up shop, they'll have a few display items, and then you want a sword, okay, fine, it's going to take a month.
Yep.
You want a new suit of armor, okay, I can do that in 3 weeks, and half now, half later, and so it forces characters to at least think about making their own items, although it's unlikely they'll do it any faster. But there is a certain element of personalization too. You can make it this exact color you want, or you can give it a certain bonus if you're successful. And so, I think it allows characters to. It's just another way that they can, kind of personalize and upgrade their character.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, I have to cut it short because I've got to move along. My wife has already waved at me to say we're running late. It was great talking to you, Chris. Ankur really does sound like a very, very interesting game. And I urge anybody that's interested to check out the links below. Chris has said that it is available through Barnes & Noble, Amazon, and, of course, Drive-Thru RPG. I will put the links below. If you have any questions, pop them in the comments below, or go on to Drive-Thru RPG and ask in the discussion session. And Chris, I'm sure, is going to be happy to answer all questions. So thank you for joining me, and hopefully we can do this again in the future.
Well, thank you, Gareth, and it's been a pleasure being on your show, and best of luck with everything you're working on as well.
All right, thanks, mate.